Okay, so let's start. Good afternoon, boa tarde, dear fellows of the Academy and all those who are joining us today. There is no need to introduce our guest speaker today. Just a few welcome words while we wait for all interested participants to connect to this video conference. Professor Paul Krugman is a famous worldly economist. He received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2008 for his work on international trade theory. He was also the recipient in 1991 of the John Bates Clark Medal, an important award given by the American Economic Association to an economist under 40. Paul Krugman is the author or editor of dozens of books, many of them also translated into Portuguese, and several hundred of articles, especially about international trade, international finance, and global economic governance. His contributions to new trade theory are basic elements in the teaching of the canon of economics at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. He is also internationally acknowledged and respected as an opinion maker on economics and economic policy issues for his regular collaboration as a columnist of the New York Times, reaching out a worldwide public sphere. One further note should be added. Paul Krugman is a foreign correspondent member of the Lisbon Academy of Sciences, and it is our privilege to have Paul Krugman as a member and to have Paul Krugman today here with us. Indeed, a great honor and a special privilege to have you with us today. Paul, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. And a special word of thanks also to our friend and confrade Jorge Braga de Macedo, who contributed to convene and to make this talk possible. Thank you, George, for your help with this. We are all anxious to listen to you. Thank you, Paul. And the floor is yours, or maybe should I say the screen is yours. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And apologies for my informality here. I'm in a very informal location. And also the truth is that I was working on this presentation until the very last minute and did not have time to change. So I hope that you don't mind that I do this in civilian clothes. I was asked, I spoke particularly with Jorge Braga de Macedo, who's an old friend, about possible topics, and he thought that it would be interesting if I were to speak about some of the unusual international trade stories, international aspects of international trade that are occurring right now, which have not, by and large, been really what any of us expected. There were many reasons to believe before the past couple of years that there might be we might be hitting some limits to globalization, that we might be seeing some downsizing of the role of trade in the world economy, which we are in fact now seeing, but not in the way or the form that I think anyone expected. And particularly the very recent events, the astonishing emergence of large-scale conventional warfare in Europe have accentuated some trends that were probably already developing that, as I said, are not really what any of us expected. And so what I'd like to do, if I can, is talk to you about first a little bit about the history of globalization, then the rather peculiar things that are happening right now, and then go back to that history of globalization and see what we see happening now and where it relates. So I'm going to try doing some screen sharing here, and we will We will see how well that works. Just a few slides, because I do think that too many is a problem, but I think they are illuminating. So let me go to here and make it a screen share, and I hope that that is working. I'm calling it War on the Breadbasket, and you'll see soon why I say that. It's a but actually, before I can explain the title of the talk, I need to talk to you about the history of globalization. So let's talk about this. We have solid data on world trade going back to early after World War II, but a great deal of effort has been put into constructing estimates of world trade before that. What I've done here is to not give you the entire data set, but the some sort of representative turning points going back to 1870. The measure here is trade openness. That's the share of imports and exports as a percentage of GDP. And this is for the world as a whole. Obviously, for the world as a whole, at least in principle, exports equal imports. So you should cut this number in half to ask what share of the average country's production is exported. That for individual countries, of course, that's not true. And one of the things that we all have talked about a great deal is that globalization in some form, quite extensive globalization, is not a new phenomenon. That the real expansion of world trade, the creation of a highly interdependent world, was made possible by the highly innovative technologies of steam engines and the telegraph, railroads, steam-powered ships, and underwater telegraph cables made it possible to have quite extensive long-range trade, beginning, well, it really began somewhat before, but really took off around 1870 with the Suez Canal, with the railroad networks being developed around the world. And world trade expanded rapidly until the eve of World War I. So you can see that there's a rise from 1870 to 1913. This peak on the eve of World War I, it was really quite impressive. There were, in particular, if you were in Northwest Europe, you were probably eating bread made from Canadian wheat, eating beef from Argentina, wearing clothing made from Australian wool, and so on. It was a lot of really long distance trade in large volumes. And I'll come back in the slide in a bit. The trade in raw materials was probably comparable as a share of income in 1913 to what it is now. It's manufactured goods that have become something new. Then came as some people say, the modern 30 Years' War, the massive wars in Europe and elsewhere, widespread protectionism, just general economic disruption, which led to a much less integrated economy. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, world trade was basically back to what it had been before the great rise of globalization. For a long period of time, we had trade liberalization, rise in world trade made possible by progressive reduction in tariffs. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which eventually became part of the foundation of the World Trade Organization. But the whole series of global trade negotiations of rounds combined with just a general, well, it's primarily occurred through negotiation, but the successive rounds of trade liberalization gradually restored world trade, but as late as the mid-1980s. World trade was really no larger as a share of GDP than it had been on the eve of World War I. Then, starting somewhere roughly late 1980s, you get something that is truly new, which I've labeled here. It's a hyperglobalization. It's this extraordinary expansion of world trade. What I can't easily show in a picture, but is very much key to this rise of world trade to levels never before seen, is what was the ability to develop complex global value chains, so that manufactured goods in particular are in the modern world. If you ask what country were they produced in, the answer is, well, actually many. So this thing is the final assembly point is China, but to call an iPhone a Chinese product is obviously extremely misleading. It's that's the final shell. Many of the components are coming from Singapore, South Korea. A large part of the design is being done in the United States. It's a global product, and this era of hyperglobalization really took off. It was made possible, we think, by in part by some rather prosaic technologies. Freight containerization has been hugely important, not so much because it reduces the cost of shipping, but because it enables you to keep track of what's shipped. A complex value chain would be impossible if you had to re-identify every item stored in a ship's hold. But if you have a bunch of sealed containers with barcodes on the side, then you know what's in them, which makes these complex chains possible. Modern telecommunications also help. And there was a revolution in trade policy beginning in the late 1980s, not so much in wealthy countries, which already had quite free trade, but the developing world turned away from import substitution to outward-looking policies. And of course, China became a market economy and a huge force in the world economy. And so we had this extraordinary expansion of world trade that took place between circa 1988 and 2008. And then flattened out and, if anything, reversed. So we have, for the past 14, well, let's go to the eve of the pandemic, and in the dozen or so years before the coronavirus hit, we actually had, if anything, a little bit of retreat from the global economy. A lot of which was not primarily because of policy changes. There was some, obviously, President Trump did some damage, but mostly it seems to be that private businesses themselves came to the conclusion that that their logistics chains were overextended, that they had exposed themselves to too much risk of disruption for the sake of small cost savings, and so they were starting to pull back. And what many of us, many people, myself included, thought that we might see a further decline in globalization, that partly because firms would be continuing to realize that they're overextended, that the big technological drivers of increased globalization had already been fully exploited, and that there would be growing political senses of political risk, the kind of if you like, hyperglobalization was made possible by the Pax Americana, was made possible by the fact that the United States was actually, if you like, was almost a co-dominion. The United States and the European Union as co-guarantors of the system of world open markets, and both in different ways were becoming less reliable in that leadership role. You all know about the U.S. politics, and the EU has clearly also had its difficulties since 2008. So many of us expected to see some retrenchment in world trade. What we did not expect was that the really big hit to world trade that we're experiencing right now is coming not in the new stuff, in the manufactured products with complex global value chains, but rather in raw materials, and especially agricultural products, the kinds of things that we've had massive international trade in, or that massive international trade began in those products a century and a half ago. The kinds of things that were heavily traded already on the eve of World War I. And you can see this in a couple of ways. And so I have a couple more charts to show you here. So let's try this again. This is, sorry, I'm using US data, but it just happens to be easier to pull together. For some reason that is not clear to me, the IMF has not been updating its world commodity price indices since last fall, which seems kind of unfortunate given everything that's happening. But these are prices for three kinds of things in the United States. The durable consumer goods is the stuff that has been affected by the now famous supply chain disruptions. These are goods that in many cases are imported from Asia. In many cases, at least the components are imported. They have been hobbled by shortages of shipping capacity, port capacity, and this rather bizarre disruption of semiconductor production, which is since semiconductors are part of almost everything. And although it's hard to see from the scale here, we have actually seen a significant rise in the price of consumer durables, which is much faster than the overall inflation rate, which is unusual. Normally, consumer durables actually tend to get cheaper over time. So there's something going on there, which is very much related to disruptions of world trade, but it's dwarfed by the rise in prices of raw materials, of oil, and of food. So we've had this has been we're having the disruption of global trade or the decline in globalization, the frictions in globalization, but not the frictions. These were not the frictions we were looking for. This is has been quite different. And in fact, I think I want to show you one more sign. The sources of the supply chain problems that have been such a source of concern and fascination in the last year and a half seem to be gradually diminishing. So this is just one kind of useful indicator. The price of container shipping, which skyrocketed last year. We think because of this pandemic-related surge. Not only was demand in general rising, but people were buying goods instead of services because they were afraid, because of the pandemic, to consume services. So the caricature, but you didn't dare go to the gym, so you bought yourself a Peloton instead. You didn't dare go to a restaurant, so you bought new kitchen appliances. Those disruptions, the price of shipping is still well above historical norms, but it's way down. So we've seen a big reduction in all of that, and lots of reasons to believe that those issues are, I mean, there will be some rethinking. Clearly, businesses will, having seen that it's not actually as safe or reliable to get to rely upon intermediate inputs that are shipped across the Pacific or shipped from East Asia through the Suez Canal to Europe. Now that people have seen that those things are less reliable, there probably will be some continuing friction and drag on manufacturers' trade. But that's turning out to be a less important story, especially, if I might say, from the point of view of a kind of humanitarian perspective, than the disruption of a much more old-fashioned kind of trade, which is trade in raw materials and especially food. So one thing you learn, and let me go back to my share screen again. Here we are. As I said, trade in raw materials and especially in food has been large for a very long time. So I'm sorry that I couldn't quickly call up comparable numbers for later than this, but this is the share of UK imports of manufactured goods, which is important. The reason that this is a really helpful number is that it turns out the UK is one of those countries where trade was very large, even before World War I. In fact, as a share of GDP, not very different from what it is today. So the fact that 80% of British imports in 1913 were non-manufactured goods is telling you that Britain was importing a lot of primary products on the eve of World War I, probably more as a share of GDP. It was importing a great deal of food in 1913. So Britain, it was perhaps exceptionally reliant on world trade, even at a time of globalization, but it's kind of illustrative of the fact that we used to have quite a lot of world trade. Then it was cut off, much of it, by events, then restored, and now it's being cut off by events again. So during World War I, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as it happens, did a really interesting study of the effects of the war on agricultural trade. And one of the things they did was to point out, was to document which areas had really become huge exporters of grain. And again, this is before World War I. And so this is a picture of wheat acreage in Europe in 1913. And it's kind of obvious, I would say, that there was a huge wheat producing area in a place that has become kind of interesting to us right now. That there was a massive agricultural development and exports from, well, the Black Earth region, which extends across Ukraine, Russia, and into Kazakhstan. Highly fertile soil. People knew that then. With the development of railway networks, it became tradable. So a lot of it was converging on the port of Odessa, which is on the eve of World War I, Odessa was, well, a couple of interesting things to say about that. On the eve of World War I, Odessa was the fourth largest city in the Russian Empire, after Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Warsaw. And if you want to understand some of the politics of the geopolitics of what's going on right now, it is worth remembering that that Poland was, essentially Russian occupied historically, and the Poles have not forgotten that. But then Odessa was a large, extremely diverse, rapidly growing city in many ways, both in terms of the kind of cultural development and in terms of its economic role. It was kind of the Eastern European counterpart of Chicago in the United States, the place where the resources of the hinterland were gathered to create a huge, diverse, dynamic metropolis. History intervened. Ukraine suffered terribly under Soviet rule, and among other things, its role as a breadbasket for the world was eliminated. There was mass famine in a place that once fed a large part of the rest of the world. And the Soviet Union imported rather than exporting wheat. But with the fall of communism, the rise of globalization, the historical economic role of that breadbasket returned. So these days the trade, agricultural trade people refer to KRU, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Ukraine, as a major grain exporting region. Except, of course, it's a little bit hard to be exporting grain when armies are ranging across your territory and the Russian Navy is blockading ports on the Black Sea. So we've taken a big part of world agricultural production and exports off the world market for the time being, which is responsible for this drastic rise in food prices. You want to think about this. This is annoying to, more than annoying, it's a hardship for people in the United States or the European Union. It's much more so. It's possibly catastrophic for people in much of the rest of the world, where food makes up a much larger part of the budget. So this is, in some ways, in terms of the sheer human impact, the deglobalization, this really significant deglobalization we're experiencing right now involves the breadbasket, involves the trade in agricultural goods. And I believe I have one more slide. No, I don't. So I can stop that and talk to you about the why it's not simply, or why there's turning out to be a kind of multiplier effect from the war in Ukraine. So even by itself, so we have Ukrainian wheat and other and actually oilseeds are also a really very important export and a very important part of the diet in a lot of the world. We have those unable to reach world markets because of the war. It's unclear, but seems probable that that effectively the war has disrupted quite a lot of exports from Russia and Kazakhstan as well, although not as intensely. But that's not where it ends. What we've been seeing is, as I said, the food is a really important, a much more important part of the cost of living in poorer countries. And so we've been actually seeing, in many cases, higher inflation in low-income countries, and particularly really high inflation for poorer families in low-income countries around the world, which brings a political reaction. And so what has been happening now is that those countries, many countries that export agricultural products, have actually been limiting or cutting off those exports. So we have China. Now, India just announced a ban on wheat exports a few days ago, which is, and the reason for that is domestic politics. It's more important for the government to try and hold down the cost of living than it is to earn, the extra foreign currency from exporting the wheat. And economists can say, look, India would be better off allowing the wheat to be exported and compensating people who are being hurt by the rise in food prices. But that doesn't, very rarely happens in practice, and they may not have the administrative capacity. The people who are tracking this, I particularly follow the people at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. They find that export restraints, especially on agricultural products, are proliferating around the world. That we've seen a remarkable amount of just shutting down of world trade in food, not through protectionism, or not through normal protectionism. We normally think of protectionism as involving limits on imports, but instead through limits on exports, which are being undertaken to try and alleviate the pain for domestic consumers, but of course then have the effect of making the pain even worse for poor families in countries that are importers of food rather than exporters. For what it's worth, by the way, these measures are illegal under global trade law. Quantitative restrictions on trade are illegal unless they're illegal under the GATT, unless they can be justified by certain very, very limited criteria, and these clearly don't meet that. And the quantitative restrictions are just as illegal if they're applied to exports as if applied to imports. But nobody is worrying about that very much. I should say, by the way, that also that this is not the, if you wanted to give a pioneering example of this kind of policy, it would actually be the United States. In 1972, Richard Nixon cut off exports of soybeans in an attempt to limit U.S. inflation. So that this is something where nobody has clean hands, but it is making all of this considerably worse for lower income people in the world economy. So what is all of this telling us? I don't think our previous concerns about the vulnerability of hyperglobalization were wrong. These extremely complex international value chains are vulnerable, and we probably had overreach in becoming too dependent upon products where, in effect, the components were shipped tens of thousands of miles before finally reaching the consumer. But it turns out that we're far more vulnerable than anybody imagined to the kind of trade contraction that took place during and after World War I. That in a world where it turns out that large-scale warfare is still possible, and a world in which nationalism has free reign, and in which if you like, there is no hegemon. There's no one to kind of enforce the rules, keep the peace on world trade, as well as literally keeping the peace in terms of people not firing artillery at each other. That even the kinds of world trade that we thought were really solidly grounded in comparative advantage are surprisingly vulnerable. I don't know where this ends up. We don't know what, of course, obviously nobody knows what's going to happen between Ukraine and Russia, and we don't know how much what happens after that. Do exports from that region revive? Do other countries that have been imposing these export restrictions return to normal? And does anybody trust it to return to normal, which is going to be really critical? But it's turned out, in any case, that the world is not flat. Globalization is a much more sensitive thing than we realized, and in particular, there were a lot of people, I have to say, probably me included, who believed that trade does a lot to ensure peace. One of my colleagues at the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, famously had the Golden Arches theory of peace, which was that no two countries that both had McDonald's operating within their borders would ever go to war. A theory which has been rather decisively refuted in the last few months. But it's now beginning to look a little bit more as if the important thing is that peace and the assurance of peace is really, really important for trade. And that the fact that the world is turning out to be a more dangerous place in ways that, in some ways that we really had not anticipated at all, is turning out to be an important new problematic factor for world trade. I don't have I don't have a prediction or a conclusion. I am just as shocked, I think, as everybody about the fact that this has all happened. But here we are, and it is really important to understand that the really decisive disruption of world trade that's taking place is the disruption of agricultural exports from one of the world's breadbaskets, and then the multiplier effect as many other countries end up restricting their exports in response to rising food prices. End of talk.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this presentation, for your talk, and raising certainly questions and comments. Just to begin with, I will ask Jorge Braga de Macedo for a short comment and questions, if there are. And while Jorge will be talking, I would like to ask all of those who are interested in asking questions to do it in a quick manner. And please raise your hand in the reactions box so that I can see, because there are more than 100 people in the screen, so it's quite difficult to see all the hands at the same time. But please do it, or send me a message through the chat device of the Zoom. So please either send a message through the chat or raise your hand in the reactions box in case you want to ask a question. Of course, we have a limit of time, and I would like to ask you to present brief questions. But first of all, Jorge, thank you again for convening this session. And Jorge, it's up to you.
Thank you, sir, also for the rapidity and patience with which everything has happened. I just want to clarify what an old friend means. Luisa and I met Paul before he had a beard. No, you can imagine how far away that was. I have basically 2 points with respect to what Paul said. First point about the nature of globalization. It's quite clear from what he said, and I agree, of course, that globalization must be measured in terms of the effect on openness, exports and imports of goods, services, and so on. There are many other measures. But I think that the fact that there was, before the globalization, that there was a great deal of movement of plants, of people, after the discoveries of the Iberian Peninsula, especially Portugal, this must be an element in the history of globalization that cannot be forgotten. So there is a globalization that immediately projects on trade. He showed that, but it would have been impossible, I would claim, or would have been different without that initial impetus of knowing the places, geography, and of course interacting with the population. That's the point about globalization. Now, as you know, I am very fond of this globalization and governance interaction. And I think a lot of what Paul said has to do with governance. And governance has become a problem, not just at the level of global governance, the international organizations, but at the level of countries and groups of countries, such as the European Union. In that respect, and he mentioned something along these lines, in that respect, I think the fact that governance is very threatened by what we are seeing, not just governance in terms of rich and poor countries, but governance even within the OECD makes it very serious. There's some work I've done that shows that trade is an engine of convergence, but you need to be in what Dick Cooper, our dear beloved friend and teacher, used to say, when interdependence to flourish needs a security community. And right now, there is no security community to speak of. So I guess final statement is full agreement, but I would even emphasize these 2 points, what happened before and the difficulties in governance also. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Paul, would you like to react to that immediately?
Certainly. The movement of, actually, of course, of plants and ideas more generally and that's something that comes quite early. So obviously, as you know, I was in Portugal until just a few days ago, and I think at least half of my meals included potatoes, which are not indigenous to Europe, and more generally, the transmission of ideas is something that is not, strictly speaking, connected with trade flows. Although one of the big questions we have, particularly if we're concerned with stagnating globalization as a possibility or a declining, is how important are these physical financial transactions in the transmission of ideas. My screen just started sharing without me meaning, so something just happened here. I hope that somebody's screen has just taken over. If you can get yourself off, that would be helpful. But in any case, I'll keep talking. The period of hyperglobalization. Hyperglobalization appears now to have been about a 20-year episode, a one-time surge in global trade based upon these value-added chains from, let us say, 1988 to 2008. This was also a period of extraordinary, unprecedented economic progress for some, though not all, emerging markets. It's a period during which the East Asia, but also South Asia, experienced extraordinary growth, going from economies that were on the edge of subsistence into not quite first world level, but extraordinary development. And not just China is the obvious case and the biggest case, but also huge growth in India, even someplace like Bangladesh saw a tripling of per capita income during this relatively short period. And a lot of this involves the transfer of technology from more advanced countries. How much of this transfer depends upon having an open global economy? If we start to retreat into ourselves, do lagging countries lose a lot of the ability to borrow knowledge from countries that are further along the development path? And yes, I mean in a very large sense, you might say that this whole trade, the world trading system was just one piece of a world system of rules and order that the Pax Americana, which eventually became more than that. It became, for a while at least, the Pax Democratica, the United States and the democratic nations of Europe together, basically creating a world in which we thought that major wars were largely unthinkable. I mean, everybody's going to point out that, well, the United States itself conducted some wars there, but the idea that there would be major attempts at conquest seemed inconceivable. And all of this was tied in very much with an ideology, or maybe I shouldn't call it that, an intellectual view, which was that closer economic ties also promoted peace. So it was, on the one hand, we created this framework of political stability enforced effectively by the great powers of the West, and economic integration that we believed would reinforce that. The European Union, as I'm sure everybody here knows, has its origins in the coal and steel community. And the purpose of the coal and steel community was really not about coal and steel. It was to make Germany and France so economically integrated that they could never go to war again, which has so far been a successful venture. But on the other hand, Germany's Ostpolitik and the growing reliance upon Russian natural gas was based in part on a view that integrating Russia with the European economy would make Russia a less aggressive power, and ended up, as far as we can tell, emboldening the current regime in Russia, because it believed that European dependence upon Russian gas basically created hostages. So it has not worked out the way it was intended. So yeah, all of these things go together, and so what we are seeing really is kind of a crisis of the international order. The trade issues are a symptom, as well as to some extent a cause of international disorder. Interesting and exciting times in a way that you really didn't want.
Thank you, Paul. So I have already 2 questions. Please, I ask you again, if you want to put any question, please, and this is both to members and non-members of the Academy, please feel free to put your questions. I have Manuel Porto. Manuel Porto has asked for, yes, please give.
Thank you very much. For me, it is a great day to hear Paul Krugman, whom I always quote in my books. I'm finishing a new edition of my textbook here in Portugal, but I quote your last edition of the International Economics. I am a strong believer in free trade, so I was influenced, I should say, by Max Gordon 48 years ago in Oxford. When I went to there, he had written the book, The Theory of Protection, and was put with, better than me, with Cambridge Economic Policy Group. But I always finished by Max Gordon. But I am strongly convinced about the free trade. If we have family in China and India, you spoke just about India. These two countries began to grow when they opened the economies with quite different political regimes and so on and so on. That is for sure, sir, it is that they began to. But I have two concrete questions in which I am strongly interested. One of them, well, I admire the states, but how can we explain that the euro area has by far the biggest surplus of the world? Even China last year did come down from second position, about $400,000 million of surplus. And the United States, with the English language, the best universities of the world, the best economies, and so on, has the biggest deficit. I could never, I should say, understand, and it's a country which I admire, but why euros has a so big surplus, the biggest of the world by far, mainly because of Germany and Holland, of course, but anyway, and the states not, and it would be important to have a surplus when I go to Macau to lecture to Chinese students or to India to see my family. So I say it is good to have open economies because with them, with high wages, social model, political democracy, we can compete. So this is the first question. The second, quickly, is the following. What is your fear, Mr. Paul Krugman, about the role of the World Trade Organization? Because the rounds, there was the Uruguay round, okay, organizing it, forming it. SEAT was a disaster. Then came the Doha round, okay. But since then, it is difficult to have a round with so many countries going ahead. So what is your view about the possibility, or whether it will be possible to go ahead with increasing the capacity of the regional blocks, now with putting together countries from different continents? Perhaps it is the way. I mean, when we have disagreements among so different countries, but what is the possibility of the World Trade Organization to go ahead? So these are the two, and congratulations. For me, it is a great day to be here with you.
Okay, those are two questions that are actually both very interesting, and I think I have a fair bit to say on each one. So I may be guilty of eating up a lot of time in responding, but I hope that people find it interesting. So on the first one, what you really want to bear in mind is that the balance of payments always balances. That a country that is running a trade deficit is running a financial account surplus. That the one way of saying this, instead of saying that the United States is running a very large trade deficit, is to say that the United States is attracting a lot of capital. There are large capital inflows into the United States, and if you ask, so why does Europe have a persistent large current account surplus? You could also ask, why does Europe have a persistent large capital? We used to call it capital account. I guess we're now supposed to call it financial account. But anyway, why does it have a large financial account deficit? And there, the answer, I think, is fundamentally that Europe has an excess of savings over investment. That in turn comes back to well, it's the same reason. Why has Europe had negative interest rates now for so long? Why is the European economy so persistently weak that the ECB needs to keep rates at rock bottom? And my main answer to that would be demography. Quite simply, you have the European Union, certainly the Euro area, is demographically, it's roughly speaking Japan with a 10 to 15 year lag. You have fertility rates have been so low that the working age population is now declining. And that means limited investment opportunities, and coupled with high savings means that Europe has basically a surplus of savings that it needs to export, and that's ultimately what drives it. And the United States, by contrast, has until recently had a more favorable demographic picture with higher fertility and higher immigration. Now we are quickly moving in your direction. Fertility is way down in the United States, and immigration has really collapsed into the United States because of politics. I might just say that extraordinary thing in the United States is that there are parts of the United States that are extremely anti-immigrant, and they happen to be the places that have essentially no immigrants, right? Midwestern states have 4% of the population is foreign born, and they hate immigration. And New York City is 38% foreign born, and we love immigrants. But what can I say? So that's the story there. I think it has nothing to do really with the all leading economies are astonishingly comparable in their technology and their productivity. They really, within the limits of measurement, labor productivity is the same in Germany, France, the United States. We have differences in GDP per head, but those are almost entirely because of, actually mostly because of vacations. Europeans take vacations and Americans don't. But that's the story there. I'm losing what the second question was. I'm sorry. That's what happens when these things. About the World Trade Organization. Okay. I am less concerned about the trade rounds. You want to think of the world trading system, both pre and post WTO, but it's starting with the GATT. There are two aspects. I think of them as ratchets and levers. The levers are the things you use to push trade up, and those are the big rounds of negotiations of trade liberalization. The ratchets are the things that stop it from sliding back down again, and those are all of the rules that say that you cannot simply go ahead and impose tariffs unless you have certain justifications, and you have to compensate for any tariff increase with other tariff reductions and so on. So there's a whole set of rules there. The ratchets are still in place. It is still the case that countries cannot are in violation of the rules if they simply engage in arbitrary protectionism. And for the most part, those rules have held. Now, that's a little bit problematic in the Trump era for the United States. We imposed tariffs on extremely, on spurious grounds. We invoked national security to block imports of aluminum from Canada, which is totally absurd. But those are really exceptional. And what has been notable, if you take a longer view, is that where there have been cases that the Bush administration's steel tariffs, that they were brought to the WTO. The main difference that the creation of the WTO did was to greatly accelerate the dispute resolution process. In the GATT, it was very, very hard to actually ever get a judgment on whether a country was violating the rules. And under the WTO, those judgments tend to come much more quickly. And the interesting thing is that by and large, so far, even powerful countries like the United States or the EU have accepted rulings that say that their trade policy is unjustified. And so that system is still in place. And look, we cannot always be liberalizing trade. I mean, what happens if trade is completely free? You can't have another round of trade liberalization. Now, we aren't actually there, but in fact, on manufactured goods, at least until the recent, now the US-China thing means that the US and China now have imposed significant tariffs on each other's manufactured goods. But that aside, world trade, certainly among OECD countries, trade in manufactured goods is very free. The tariff rates are very low. There really isn't that much room for further liberalization, except in what are known to be extremely difficult areas like agricultural products, where you are getting into whole questions about defense of traditional ways of life. It's even when we talk about Brexit, there has been no significant tariff change as a result of Brexit. As far as conventional tariffs are concerned, trade between the UK and the EU is still essentially free. The problem is that the disruption comes from the fact that because the UK is no longer part of the customs union, there's a whole lot of frictional costs at the border. Even though the tariffs are very low, there is a lot of extra costs simply involved in getting stuff through. So you have but it's more of a paperwork barrier than it is a tariff barrier. So I'm not my concern about the WTO. The fact that we haven't, I mean, Doha was probably there was it was almost doomed to fail from the beginning. It was never well specified, and the attempted big trade agreements, TTIP, TPP, were really not, the economic case for them was never very strong. They were, so I paid a lot more attention, I have to say, to the Pacific one, but TPP was always about geopolitics. It was really less about making trade freer than it was about countering Chinese influence, and domestic politics just weren't prepared to make that deal. So what worries me instead, so I don't think the fact that we haven't had a significant trade round since Uruguay, I don't think that's important. What I think is important is the fact that the world trading system does require that there be a couple of major powers that are prepared both to obey the rules themselves and to kind of enforce the rules for others. And in a dozen years ago, I would have said, okay, there's the United States and there's the EU, who are really, on terms of trade, the co-equal powers. Or, military force, they're not at all similar, but in terms of impact on world trade and ability to bring their weight to bear on countries that don't follow the rules, the US and the EU are co-equal, and we're both, it seemed, committed to maintaining the system. So I was really quite optimistic about the future of the world trading system. But now, when you have the United States in a crisis of democracy, that's not our subject today, but obviously we're in big trouble. And when we have the EU experiencing a great deal of disunity and having its own more limited crises of democracy in some of its member countries, it's not clear who's going to do the work of keeping this trading system going. So it's not really an institutional question. The WTO is actually a well-designed institution, and the dispute settlement mechanism has been a real success story. But the problem is, until America and Europe can get our domestic houses in order, the world system is extremely vulnerable.
Thank you, Paul. I've seen two other participants who would like to ask questions. Elder Rodrigues, are you still there? Elder, I think I've seen your hand raised. Elder Rodrigues? Yes, Elder Rodrigues? Apparently not with us. And Tomé Ribeiro. Tomé, are you still with us? Tomé Ribeiro? Tomé Ribeiro?
Yes, I am. Yeah. Can you hear me? All right.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Sorry about the delay. So my question was, in international relations, there's some authors who blame economics and the dominance of economics as a science for obscuring a part of this geopolitical story. So for obscuring geopolitical dynamics in favor of market-dominated economic trade flows. So the question is, does Mr. Krugman, and thank you for the conference. It's being really very good. Does Mr. Krugman think that this has been part of the problem? So as economics helped take away a bit of the story and lulled us into a full sense of security? And if so, what can economics learn from this? Is there a lesson for economics here? Thank you.
Okay. I think, okay, let me, I think there are two stories that that are here. There, my answer to that question differs greatly for OECD countries and for emerging markets. So actually, strictly speaking, some of them are OECD as well. But for advanced countries or high income countries and middle income countries, for high income countries, the important thing to say is that the formulation of trade policy these past 70 years has had very little to do with economic theory or economists. It just we didn't reduce tariffs. We didn't create a relatively open trading system because economists convinced politicians of the virtues of free trade. If anything, it was always political. If you want to look into the history, that the modern world trading system was created largely by, if there's a single founder, it would be Cordell Hull, who was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Secretary of State and who believed very strongly that trade promotes peace. And then they built a system whose underlying logic is not that of economics. It's actually mercantilism, but enlightened mercantilism. It is exports are good, imports are bad, so you win if you export and you don't import, but an equal increase in exports and imports is good. And so we made a deal, we basically did deals that linked you reduce your tariffs on my goods if I reduce my tariffs on your goods. And the United States began doing that in the 1930s with bilateral deals, and then after World War II became the multilateral deal. So this was all, and economics textbook economic professors played essentially no role in this. Where I think you can say that economists may have played a role is in convincing a lot of emerging markets to liberalize hard and fast, that there was a really drastic move towards liberalization starting in the late 1980s and a little bit earlier in a few places. And this was sold with the claim that it would do great things for economic growth, that bring down your tariff barriers and you too can be South Korea, basically. There are now infamous World Bank reports from 1993, I think, suggesting that shifting from inward-looking to outward-looking policies would reliably add 2 or 3 percentage points to your growth rate, which has turned out to be false. Countries have some countries seem to have done very well with liberalization, others have not. Some countries that have done very well retain quite a lot of government intervention in the economy. So there was a lot of overselling of markets, the virtues of free markets, which may have contributed to some political backlash, some instability. I'm not sure how far you want to take that. If I look at the places in the emerging world where the political economy is turning ugly, I'm not sure that we can say that neoliberalism, as sold by economists, was a prime cause. But still, the fact of the matter is that economists did make a lot of promises about free trade that have not been borne out for many countries. And that's true for it's true for in particular for if you like for my concern, Latin America in particular was effectively promised that they could be Asia if they opened up trade, and has not turned out to be the case.
Thank you, Paul. We have two last questions. Let's have the two questions first, and then Paul, you will close the answering the questions. One is by Pedro Pita Barros. Pedro, would you like to join us and ask your question, Pedro?
Sure. First of all, thanks for this discussion. It's quite illuminating, quite instructive. Made me think a couple of things different. And one of them was how this sort of evolution that you're mentioning is going to change the economic and political balance within the European Union first, and then with the European Union, with the US and China, on trade policies for sure, but also on things like intellectual property rights and protection of national interests by avoiding technology transfer and this sort of thing. So how much of this is going to undermine or strengthen the European Union as a bloc or as a partner bloc with the US and with China?
Thank you, Pedro. And finally, Miguel Souza, Rocha de Souza. Yes, Miguel? Yes. Yes, turn your micro, please, Miguel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I have just a simple question. As you are a leading theorist on international trade, you know the approach by Ricardo Hausmann about the index of complexity. And my question is the following. Does war increase or reduces complexity? We know that from intra-industrial trade, there is more complexity. And does war reduces this index? Is it good? Is it bad? How can you comment on this, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. So, Paul, this is your...
Okay, so the last two things. The balance of power issue is... it's hard for me to be sure how much the economics is going to really be determinative here, although I think there are some large shifts. If within the EU, it's very difficult for me to judge what the hell if I say that the world is kind of lacking a hegemon, the EU is definitely lacking a hegemon. Okay, the ugly American comment. It looks to me as if there's a kind of competition between the leaders of France and Germany as to who can do worse in rising to the occasion right now. And I don't know where all of that goes. So that's really problematic, and that in turn means that the EU is a reduced force in world affairs. Even the EU has the resources, the sophistication to be a really big player, and has been in some ways. I mean, it's a major provider of foreign aid, and that it gives it a lot of leverage in much of the world. But right now, it just seems confused and not clear where it's trying to go. Again, whatever you may think of, right now, we have there's a war on, and at least on verbally, the entire democratic world is supporting Ukraine. But if you want to ask who is actually providing relevant aid right now, it would be some Eastern European countries, Britain, and the United States, and the EU is just not there. The complexity. I think all of this. I mean, the complexity is hard to sustain. Certainly, in complexity that sprawls across national borders is hard to sustain when you have insecurity of trade, insecurity. I mean, I think we're probably heading for a world, even though I've been emphasizing in my talk, I emphasized the raw materials issue. We certainly are heading for a world in which everybody is going to be extremely nervous about relying for crucial components of the supply chain on regimes they don't trust. And there are a lot of regimes out there that we don't trust. So we're certainly going to see in the United States, and I suspect in Europe as well, an attempt to reshore a lot of key production of a lot of key industrial components that maybe not. I mean, we're probably not going to try to bring manufacture of clothing back to the United States, but we're already seeing a move to, not be reliant on China for rare earths, not to be reliant on China for semiconductors. And so that means that we're going to be seeing a decomplexification of world trade. World trade is going to go back to the simpler form it had, where countries exchange sort of finished goods rather than complex value chains. And I do worry about, one of the virtues of this complex world trade was that it opened market niches for a lot of countries. That it meant that countries, put it this way, back when we first realized that export-oriented manufactured growth was an option for developing countries, which was when there were first a relatively small group of East Asian countries that were doing it. We used to worry about, well, how big is the world market for labor-intensive products? How can the world absorb if everyone tries to become Taiwan? And part of the answer to that has been that you can take the labor-intensive pieces of a production process and locate them in emerging markets, which created a vastly increased scope. But if we're become afraid to have these complex value chains, then the opportunities for development in emerging markets are reduced. So that's something to be worried about.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Paul, for your talk and the discussion. You said at the end of your talk that peace is important for trade. Yes, it is. Yeah. And let's hope that peace will be reached soon, so that the economic consequences of the war will not leave us in a deglobalized world. We are no longer used to live in such a world, and so let's hope that peace will come soon. Thank you very, very much. It was a privilege and an honor to have you with us today. And I would like to ask all participants to thank Professor Paul Krugman for his illuminating talk and discussion. Thank you very much, Paul.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. All right.
Okay, thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you.